trigger, or the inciting incident of a novel, is actually the smallest of the three climaxes that usually appear in a traditional novel structure, but despite that, it can be the most exciting because it can really make your reader sit up and say, oh, this is getting good. Hello everyone, I'm Deanna and I'm trying to scribble my way to becoming a traditionally published author. And today I'm going to tell you the top 8 things that each trigger or inciting incident should do in order to make sure that your novel starts off with a bang. Before we start, just a quick reminder that if you're interested in learning more about me, what I'm writing, or my qualifications, then you can find all of that on my channel. Also, this video is weeks 8 to 9 of my series on how to write a book for complete beginners. So if you're interested in the rest of the series, you can check the other videos out down below. Especially the plotting video is relevant to this if you want any more detail on writing triggers and inciting incidents. And do keep in mind that both this video and the series as a whole is geared primarily towards beginners, but of course, that doesn't mean that I don't occasionally drop in nuggets for more experienced writers as well. But let's just get into it. So, if you're following my suggested timings, and you're continuing to hit your word goals as part of the beginners series that I've been filming, then at this point you should be around the 3,000 to 7,000 words mark in your manuscript. So you're getting pretty close to where the trigger or the inciting incident should fall. If you remember, my personal rule of thumb is that it should definitely happen before the 10,000 word mark, but if you're following online guides, then a lot of agents and editors say that it should be around the 10% to 15% mark of your total word count for your novel. Either way though, whether you're following my guideline, an online guideline, or you're just writing at your own pace, here are the 8 key things that your inciting incident or your trigger should do. Actually, wait, in case you don't know what a trigger or an inciting incident is, just a quick definition. This is basically the second plot beat or type of event that happens in a traditional novel structure. So usually start with your stasis, which is where your characters are living their normal day-to-day lives, or normal for them, not necessarily normal for the reader. And then the trigger or the inciting incident is the thing that happens next that basically starts the story, breaks their normal day-to-day routine or life, and basically forces them into the plot. Anyway, for ease, I have divided these 8 tips into the 3 pillars of storytelling or planning that we talked about before. So that is plot, character, and setting. So we are actually going to start with setting because there's only one tip for this, or one kind of thing that your inciting incident should do, and that is the inciting incident should be when your main character departs into a new world. Now, I put this in setting, but it doesn't actually have to be literal. Departing into a new world or departing from the known world just means that a new aspect has opened up to them of their surroundings, of the people around them, of their world, of themselves maybe, and their own nature. You know, obviously that's quite common with things like Chosen One stories. The revelation is about the character themselves, not necessarily about the setting. But obviously sometimes it can be literal, and it can be the protagonist literally discovering that a parallel world exists, or, you know, there's kind of magical creatures living right alongside their mundane life. So it can be a setting thing, but with that, we're gonna get into character next. So this is what the trigger or the inciting incident should do for character, and this is number 2. The trigger should have something to do with what the main character wants, and a lot of the time it should have something to do with what the antagonist wants as well. I'm going to be using the Hunger Games throughout this again because I just think it's such a clear and easy example, and one that most people are familiar with as well. Obviously, the inciting incident in the Hunger Games is that Prim, Katniss's sister, gets chosen for the Hunger Games, and Katniss volunteers in her place. So in this case, the trigger fulfills both of those requirements. It has something to do with what the main character wants, which is obviously, for Katniss, her family to be safe and happy, particularly her sister, and it has something to do with what the antagonist wants, which is snow, or you could say in this case it's the entire wider kind of structure of Panem. But either way, in this case the trigger threatens what the main character wants, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be either something that threatens what the main character wants, or it can be a promise of the main character being able to get something they want. And this then determines whether your main character spends the rest of the novel trying to get back to their status quo because the trigger was something they didn't want or they wanted to avoid, or if they're trying to actually prolong what the trigger did because the trigger was something ostensibly positive for them. Point number 3, and the other thing that the trigger should do for your character, is force them to act or make a choice with a time limit. So I don't mean there has to be a countdown, you know, or an actual clock, but it basically means that, just like with Katniss, your main character should respond to the trigger. Like, their job is to respond and to choose the call to adventure, to choose to get involved with the plot and respond to what the trigger has done. And obviously no one wants to read, well, Let me rephrase. Most people probably don't want to read 3 whole chapters of your character trying to decide whether they're going to respond to the trigger or not, and that's where the time element comes in. It should be a pretty quick kind of 1-2 situation where the threat or the offer of what the trigger is, whether it's a positive or negative, should need a timely response from the protagonist, and the protagonist should, most of the time, agree to become part of the plot. Again, not always, but as we talked about before, passive characters are kind of hard to write, disclaimer, etc. And now, all the rest of these points are to do with plot. So here are the things that your trigger or inciting incident should do for your plot. 4 is your trigger should align with the theme and the genre of your novel. So I harp on about this quite a lot on this channel, but genre is so important, especially when you're a beginner novelist. Like, it tells you so much about the decisions that you need to make for your book. Including word count, the types of things that happen, the types of characters you have. Genres really do exist for a reason. So when we say that the trigger should be connected to your genre, what we mean is, if you're writing a cozy fantasy, it might not be appropriate for your trigger event to be a gruesome murder. I mean, it might be appropriate if you're writing a kind of satirical take on it, like, you know better than me, but just really think about whether your trigger makes sense for the kind of story that you're trying to tell. And it's similar for your theme. Whatever the overarching message of your novel is, again, if any of this is confusing, you can find explanations online or in my plot video. But basically, obviously, your overarching message, such as, love conquers all, for instance, should definitely be connected to the trigger. The trigger should have kind of a seed of that meaning, or a way to start the reader thinking along those lines and asking the kind of question that you're trying to answer. So, again, if your theme is that love conquers all, maybe your trigger is something to do with the limits of love and whether there is a limit to love, for instance. And then obviously your climax will answer with, no, it's fine, love conquers all. Number 5, in terms of plot, as I just said, it's usually the trigger is usually not something done by your protagonist. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. It is important to consider whether your protagonist should be active in their own trigger, basically. So if, for instance, you want them to feel guilty about the trigger, like they feel like they are responsible for their own problems, or they are responsible for whatever goes wrong for the rest of the plot, maybe they are involved. Maybe yours is a story of kind of taking ultimate responsibility for your own problems or your own flaws or whatever it is. But a lot of the time, that's not really the point of most people's plots, and therefore the thing that happens to start the plot is usually external, and then it is the character responding to that makes up the story. So again, that kind of connects back to your theme too, depending on what you want your message to be. Number 6, as we said, is that the trigger should upset the status quo. Now, this is obviously one of the most important aspects of a trigger. You can't have a trigger that allows the protagonist to continue exactly as they were in the stasis, because then that's not a trigger. The entire core of it is that their life changes, their world changes, they find out something new about themselves, or their usual components or the people in their life are somehow altered. If you have a trigger that you feel like is not working, maybe there's actually no meaningful change in your trigger, or maybe the change is just not big enough for the scale of the story you're trying to tell. That's a possibility too, so really kind of think about what has materially changed for the protagonist, and the answer is not a lot. They just have a new favorite food. Unless you're writing a very, very quiet literary novel, that's probably not going to be a big enough change to constitute a trigger, so think about the scale and the highs and lows that you're trying to cover. Number 7 is that the trigger should create questions for the reader. So basically, the trigger should create intrigue. This is obviously the point at which the plot is being propelled for the first time into the rest of the story, so you really want to make sure that you don't give away too much at this stage, because it could basically completely destroy any kind of tension or questions that the reader has. So you have to get that balance right of revealing a little bit about what's going on, enough to create interest and to give your character drive to follow that thread, but not so much that the tension completely deflates and the reader feels like they already understand everything about the story and there's nothing more to uncover. And number 8, a little bit similarly to the previous point, the trigger should sow the seeds for the later climaxes in the novel, which includes the midpoint and also the final climax towards the end. And usually the way the trigger does this is by establishing the stakes. Now, ideally, you would have established the stakes already. To go back quickly to the Hunger Games example, obviously, even before we are introduced to the concept of the Hunger Games and Katniss volunteers, we can already feel the importance of her family, how much she's struggling to feed them and keep them alive through her conversations with Gale. So essentially, you want to make sure that the stakes, which you've hopefully already established, crystallize, and for lack of a better word, become real for both your character and your reader. Like I said, you kind of want that sitting up, oh shit moment from your reader where they're like, oh now it's real, now I'm invested. And really, that is the ultimate point of the trigger, is kind of basically a twisting point where you bring in everything that you've been working on in the stasis to show the reader why they should care and why they should keep reading. And those are the 8 things that every successful inciting incident or trigger should do. As I said, this is a very brief summary, honestly more of almost a checklist for troubleshooting. So yeah, if you're looking for more detail, please do check the videos down below. Also, if you found this helpful, please do consider subscribing so you don't miss the next video, which will be on, honestly, I'm still deciding. We might cover the snowflake method because I haven't done that yet, and we still have a ways to go before the quest / the promise of the premise / the fun and games, word count wise, for the pace that I've set for the series. But we might jump straight into that, honestly. And also, as always, my comments are open for any kind of problems that you're having or questions you have, and if someone suggests a topic that sounds good, maybe I'll cover that instead. And as always as well, I'll be posting my usual writing vlogs, so if you're interested in how my novel is going, I'm currently on draft 2, please feel free to check those out. Thank you again so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!